Hello, welcome everyone. Thanks very much for joining the session this afternoon. My name is Dr. John Callegher, or just John. I'm a professor at George Brown College in Toronto and the project director for Job Talks Access. I have short black hair and tan skin, and I'm wearing a dark blue polo shirt. I'm very happy to have joining me today members of our project, which was a national survey of workers with disabilities, and to engage with each of them in what we're calling a sneak peek discussion ahead of releasing the full survey at 100 pages long to the general public in the new year. I would like to introduce, I'll say each of their names first and then have them introduce themselves a little more. Dr. Mahadeo Sukhai, Paul VanderGreindt, and Benjamin Millard. Mahadeo, can you introduce yourself to the, one or two people who don't know who you are already?
Hi, everybody. There's probably lots of you who don't know who I am. My name is Dr. Mahadeo Sukhai. I am the Vice President of Research and International Affairs and Chief Accessibility Officer for the Canadian National Institute for the Blind, which collaborated with John on this really cool project. I'm a brown-skinned man with dark hair and very thick glasses. And today I'm wearing a purple sweater with a purple shirt and a purple tie. You perhaps sense a theme with the purple.
Thank you very much, Mahadeo. And Paul, can you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. As said, Paul VanderGreindt. I'm a former George Brown student and research assistant on the Job Talks Access project. I'm white-skinned man, black glasses, buzz cut, unkempt beard. I'm just a precursor for Ben here, and a black sweater on.
Thank you, Paul. And Ben?
Hi, folks. John introduced me as Benjamin Millard, but I'd like to go by Ben. I have white skin, red hair, and red beard, and I'm wearing a light blue shirt today. I am the project director with QI Value Systems. We were the main research partner on this project and really looking forward to diving into some of the results.
Terrific. Thanks, everyone. So yeah, this was a very, a deep dive survey that we conducted with Canadian, National Institute for the Blind, QI Value Systems, and the Career Foundation in Ontario. And it launched early last year, and we've collected and analyzed, interpreted, reported the data. We're excited to release it at some point next year, the full report. This was a 25 or more minute study, a survey of more than 900 workers with disabilities across Canada. And that included a minimum of 200 responses, with those reporting at least some difficulty in the areas of sight, hearing, walking, climbing, remembering, concentrating, self-care, and communicating. And of course, there were many among the sample that had multiple disabilities. But without going too much into that kind of detail, for anyone who loves tables and charts and percentages, you're going to love the report. But for the sake of this discussion, we wanted to focus a bit more on the higher level findings, as well as some open-ended, as we say in research, verbatim, some comments and the themes around them, and just get our panelists to respond. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, by way of introduction, a big theme that came out from this report, again, of more than 900 workers with disabilities across Canada, which is untapped potential. The three most agreed upon statements from workers with disabilities are as follows. And I do want to just read them. I'll read them slowly. The three most agreed upon statements. I think on the whole, people underestimate what persons with disabilities are capable of achieving. With the right support, most persons with disabilities are just as capable and competent as most persons without disabilities. And finally, I think most persons with disabilities are, quote, underemployed, unquote. They are capable of doing much more than is available or offered to them. So I think, so just to start this off, we think in a progressive age, everyone, that I think people probably would be under the impression that those with disabilities are in fact empowered, are in fact more encouraged to reach their full potential at work. But the data reveal that that might be far from reality for some people. I started with Mahadeo, so I'll get you to respond to that, Mahadeo. Why is this belief apparently far from reality?
I think different people have different definitions of the word empowered. I have one definition of the word empowered that perhaps isn't shared by others within, others within workplaces generally, may not be shared by employers. It may not be shared by society, right? Is the goal to get a job, or is the goal to get a job where we feel like we're valued and we feel like we can contribute meaningfully? I was on a mentorship call with somebody earlier this week who is currently jobless, and their particular comment in describing their job search was some job is better than no job. Any job is better than no job, even if it's not in the space that they really wanted to go into. And I mean, that's the perspective of a person with a disability. And if that's the perspective of a person with a disability, how are we internalizing that from the rest of society? And how has the rest of society internalized, well, what's it mean for a person with a disability to be empowered? Does that mean they have a job? And if persons with disabilities have jobs, then is any job sufficient? So I think different people are thinking about empowered in different ways.
Right. Thank you. And I mean, on that note, Paul, over to you. What does empowered mean to you?
Well, I think it was described pretty well. As far as, a misrepresentation, I think maybe from the reality is, there's going to be obvious success stories, and there is loss, but there's also going to be plenty of shortcomings that may not be the headline. So for workers with disabilities, I think that it's more of a process, a conversation, as opposed to a statement of success or failure in the workplace. And you're going to have varying opinions, throughout that.
Great. And thanks, Paul. And Ben, how about you? Why is the belief that workers with disabilities are empowered seem to be far from reality?
Yeah, well, in addition to the two great points made there, I was also thinking about this and looking through the lens of worthwhile endeavors. Like in Ontario, we have the Access for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, which has a minimum standard of accommodation. And I think initiatives like that, legislation is very worthwhile and it's great, but unfortunately it can give the false perception that the work is done in some ways. When, to Mahadeo's point, sometimes it comes down to a more personal level of accommodation, and what does empowerment mean to the individual? Because it's great to have a baseline, but the true empowerment, it usually comes back to more of a personal definition and a circumstantial kind of view on what that means.
That's a great point. It's the policy. There's a policy there. Problem solved. Moving on, right?
Yeah.
Paul, I'll start with you with this next question. We discovered in the report, or we confirmed that the most common sector of employment for persons with disabilities is in clerical, administrative, followed by retail. Curious, in your opinion, are there other sectors where there are opportunity for greater participation among workers with disabilities?
Yes, all of them, definitely. I think it's more what you want as an individual, and with any person, regardless of ability and any employer, there's going to be limitations. So I'd say it's more about finding a fit and a positive outcome for the employer, the employee, and the work being done. And there's limitations with any job, so there shouldn't be a limitation on what you can try or what what is available to you as a worker, any type of worker.
Awesome, great answer. Mahadeo, your take.
Give me the question again, John. I'm trying to process this.
In what sectors are there more opportunities for greater participation among workers with disabilities? The top two being clerical, administrative, and retail.
So I mean, I think the question comes down to, where are people underrepresented, but where are people going to school, right? And so for example, I can't say the sciences is an answer to your question, because the problem is that the persons with disabilities are underrepresented in the sciences in school, and so there aren't people to fill the pipeline in the workplace, right? And I mean, I also think that you look at the list of places where persons with disabilities are participating currently, and then you ask yourself, again, what's the meaning of participation? Just because someone may work in retail, does that mean that they have the ability to advance in their career? Does that mean that they have the ability to change jobs with some level of security, that they'll get a good reference and they'll move into a newer and better position, right? So I'm gonna take a bit of a different tactic in answering the question and say that I think in all sectors there can be improvement in participation, improvement in engagement. I think each sector is going to be different. There's a bunch of sectors where during the pandemic, people were able to work remotely, and that was a great thing. But during the pandemic, other people had no choice but to be in person. And for the population of persons with disabilities, that wasn't necessarily a great thing, right? So my complete non-answer to your question is that I think it's really it really depends. It depends on what people have studied. It depends on how people want to move around, and it even depends on what we consider sort of participation within the sector to be.
Terrific. Thanks, Mahadeo. And I just want to let our panelists know that it looks like there's around 60 participants in the forum here, so no pressure. As we continue, I think I also want to encourage those participants to put some questions in the Q&A or chat. I think there are already some there popping up, and I think we will have time to get to them after we've completed our discussion. So please.
And John, I would also add, and I'm going to swap my panelist hat off and put on my steering committee participant member hat, and say that at the end of this session, there's a 20-minute networking session that follows immediately right afterward. And we would absolutely encourage everyone to stay and participate. We have a question for the networking session, but given the nature of the comments coming through the chat and the Q&A, I feel like we're going to have lots to talk about.
Terrific, for sure. Load them up, everybody. Okay, all right. Ben, I'm actually going to come to you with another question, because you're very close to this particular revelation, big finding from our study. And for background for everyone watching, Job Talks is my company, and we produced a study of Canadian workers, the workers in the general population, according to their workplace satisfaction, what they value at work. And the results revealed 5 segments of the Canadian population that were distinct in terms of worker happiness. And without getting into all 5, I will tell you the 2 that really stuck out, and the big finding, which is how they compared to workers with disabilities. So we had one area of the Canadian workforce, everyone, that we call bottom rungers, who are more likely to say that they're dissatisfied in their jobs. They have, it's characterized by having little control over their work. and who are overall frustrated. Among the general public, 26% of Canadians are bottom rungers. When we ask the same questions to workers with disabilities, 51% are bottom rungers. The other major finding was related to feeling fulfilled, to having control in your job, to feeling growth and usefulness to society. Among the general population of Canadians, 27% are fulfilled. And among workers with disabilities, 6%. 6%. So to quickly recap, general population of who are bottom rungers, 26%, compared to 51% among those with disabilities. And among those feeling fulfilled in the general population, 27%, compared to just 6%, single digit 6, among workers with disabilities. Ben, what was your initial reaction to this finding?
Initially, I think it's obvious. I was a bit disappointed to find that these workers may be struggling in some ways. And then digging into the data a bit more, I became a bit confused because in our initial segmentation, you saw that these bottom rungers, they tended to be a little younger, they were lower kind of on the organizational ladder, you know, the bottom rung kind of thing. And when you looked at the workers with disabilities that we surveyed, many of them were older, later in their careers, and they were relatively high up and influential in the organization. So that made me a little bit confused about it. But when you start diving into it and you look at the overall characteristics of this segment, they can be summed up in kind of a nutshell that they're not entirely satisfied with their work, but they do believe things will improve. They're going to continue climbing the ladder. And I think that takes on a different nature with workers with disabilities. They enjoy their jobs. They want to keep working. They want to contribute. They're dissatisfied because the accommodation may not be enabling them to be fully empowered and to reach their potential, but they're not going to give up on it. They're going to keep working away at it, which I thought was encouraging in the end. But again, the initial finding that they're somewhat dissatisfied at work was disappointing. And I would also add, we sort of saw an interesting phenomenon with these segments. We had a very low proportion of those who were in the fulfilled segment. But when we looked at workers with disabilities who did make up that 6%, they tended to have a very unique way of going about work. They tended to be more self-employed or going it alone, working in very small organizations with a partner or just one or two other people. So the ones that were fulfilled kind of found their fulfillment by chucking the system and finding their own way and making their own accommodation, which is, again, encouraging in the end, because if we can personalize accommodation and make it truly effective for the individual, there's a lot of potential to be unlocked here.
Excellent, Ben, and thanks for teasing the report some more. Really going to be exciting when people see it. Paul, how about you? What did that result strike in you when you read it, when you looked at the data?
Unfortunately, I'd say I wasn't surprised to see that, just because of, like we're talking about before, we have progress, but there's work to do. So it wasn't surprising to see that. I think that if, in my opinion, it would stem from, you know, the perception that workers with disabilities are less capable. They passed over for opportunities for that reason. And to Ben's point, you know, gradually climbing a ladder, there's not a lack of motivation, but there's always going to be barriers, and some of that might be, you know, mindset or managers that are, in, for lack of a better term, holding you back. And again, it's a conversation and a process to get better at that.
Great, thanks, Paul. And Mahadeo, I mean, this segmentation was one of the reasons we got together in the first place and launched this survey. What were you expecting to learn, and what were your impressions of the result? on this topic.
So the funny thing is you can never validate a hypothesis. You can only falsify it. And the thing is that John, you remember when you and I first started talking about this 5 or 6 years ago, I came to you and I said, I think this might happen. And sadly, you did not falsify my hypothesis. And I'm going to add something to what Ben said, because Ben admitted to some initial confusion in terms of who actually fell within the bottom runger group and who fell within the fulfill group. And as I listened to you talk it out, I'm not the least bit confused about why that's the case. And I'm going to add something that hasn't come up in conversation, because I think Ben, you referred to accommodation. Paul, you referred to the system, but it's also the environment. It's the people we work with. It's the people we work for. Sometimes it's even the people who work for us if we're that high enough up, right? And so in just about any workforce imaginable, persons with disabilities are in the minority. Even at an organization like CNIB, 30% of our staff is persons with disabilities, but that means that 70% of our staff are persons who don't identify as living with disabilities, right? And that 70 outweighs that 30. And so in just about every work scenario you can think of, except I'm an entrepreneur and I'm the sole owner of my business, right? Or I'm the sole owner of my business and I'm working with somebody who has similar lived experiences, or a small group of people who have similar lived experiences. In almost every scenario you can think of, the person with a disability in the workplace is in the minority, right? And often it's a crushing minority. I'm the only person with my lived experience in this environment, and how do I go to work every day and try to constantly explain how I do things, or what do I need in order to make sure I can communicate? What do I need in order to make sure I can access information? The fact that me not making eye contact with you is not a crime because of neurodivergence or because of sight loss or because of whatever, right? And so the fact of the matter is that if you've got a great supportive environment, and I'm spoiling things because this is also in the data, if you've got a great supportive environment, you have a better experience. If you have a crappy environment, you have a worse experience. And your environment in one part of your job could be great and supportive, but in another part of your job could be absolutely crappy. And ultimately the crappy is going to outweigh the great and supportive no matter what you do, unless everywhere is great and supportive. And so I would say, it's not just about the system. It's not just about the accommodation. It's about the environment. It's about the people around you. And if you, for example, transition bosses because your boss, is promoted and you start to report to somebody else, or your boss leaves for whatever reason and you report to somebody else, the very act of changing supervisors might fundamentally change how you think about work, right? And we need to recognize that the work is really defined by the system and by the people, right? Mm-hmm. The accommodation that's a tiny part of it. It's the system and it's the people. And if those two parts combine to I'm just going to say be soul crushing, right? Then that's going to explain the data that we have.
Thanks, Mahadeo. Well, let's jump further into that environment, right? And you mentioned colleagues, co-workers, but managers also came up as an important piece of information coming from our sample. And when we asked specifically in an open-ended way, provide an open-ended answer, about the biggest challenges, problems, or needs that workers with disabilities are facing. First off, were physical barriers, all kinds of descriptions related to physical barriers. Around 44%, we came in with those types of answers, but more than a quarter, 27% of participants raised issues with management and leadership within the organization. So Paul, I'm going to come to you next, but just before that, I'll read some of the quotes here from respondents related to problems with managers, lack of support from management, lack of understanding of disabilities, being treated like children when we are full adults, the unwillingness to see individuals with disabilities as people, not being taken seriously. And just a final one here, the company just made up a job for me that was meaningless. I could have been doing much more. The frustration is doing jobs that you're not meant for. Paul, just get your reaction to those quotes.
Yeah, I would say that managers, there's always going to be bad managers. We've probably all been through that at one point or another. And when it comes to dealing with workers with disabilities, it's a big part of it, but for me, it's not necessarily about the disability. It's interacting on more of a human level with that person and just being open to more communication and problem solving when it comes to working with disabilities. It's just, being a bit more open-minded and having that open communication to find solutions and different ways, like you mentioned, making new jobs that don't mean anything instead of adapting a job to get the most potential out of it. And so when it comes to managers, the training is maybe different in theory than it is in practice, and it's more about just being able to connect with employees and finding the best outcome.
Well, thanks, Paul and Mahadeo, and then I'll go to you, Ben. But just briefly, Mahadeo, I mean, don't managers receive training? What's going? Why are we getting this kind of response? These types of pretty harsh words if people are speaking plainly in describing the management treatment that they're receiving. Aren't managers trained in this?
Where would they get the training? And that's to some degree that's a rhetorical question, although I'm happy to pose it to everybody, right? So I mean, think about this. Your organization is big. You've got a president and chief executive officer or whatever their title is, a managing director, what have you. They have a C-suite and a bunch of vice presidents. Underneath them are the senior managers, and underneath them are the line managers, and underneath them are the people who are reporting to the line managers, right? And so if you're a person with a disability whose staff reporting to a line manager, that line manager is squeezed between all of the leadership commitments that the senior leaders are making and what they need to do to deliver what they need to do, right? And in that squeeze between the senior leadership's commitment statement and the need to be productive is this issue of, are people trained to be inclusive managers, right? And so if everyone's measured based on, are you being productive, whatever definition of productivity your company may have, then the argument that needs to be made is inclusion equals greater productivity, right? But that's a counterintuitive argument to a lot of people, because to be inclusive actually takes more effort and more time invested up front. And once you're used to being inclusive and you start to think about being inclusive as if it were just like breathing, right? Then it's just part and parcel of all of your conversations and part and parcel of who you are and your authenticity and your integrity as a leader and as a manager. But until you get there, it's a time investment. And so the problem tends to be that nobody wants to put that time in up front, because the long-term benefit just isn't as necessarily as obvious. And some things, and disability and productivity are two words that have lots of problems when they sit together. Because I've actually been in situations where I've had to advocate on behalf of my team to people above me to make sure that the people above me understand that the issue at hand isn't a productivity issue, it's an accessibility issue, right? And when productivity and accessibility get conflated, then we start to run into problems. And I got to tell you that we're great for conflating lack of productivity with disability, because we make assumptions. We say that people with disabilities who are present in the workforce are less productive without assistive technology or accommodation. We say that that people with disabilities are more likely to take sick days, or more likely to not be at work. So terms like presenteeism and absenteeism become these things that get associated with persons with disabilities, and so then those myths get propagated forward to the point where the culture is set up such that every manager wants to be productive, because that's how they're judged. And no manager wants to take the time to learn to be inclusive, when in reality, those are not two separate conversations. Those need to be one conversation, productivity and inclusivity together. Soapbox, I
Thanks.
apologize.
All good. Ben might give you a little time back. We'll see. But Ben, Mahadeo mentioned, probably something that's very true. The idea that managers just aren't willing or able to put in the time, either able or not willing, or both. What say you to that? And say a little more about this this finding here.
Yeah, I think it does speak to a general bias in business and that sort of thing, where the performance metric tends to take the front seat. And I take it back to a sports analogy. I'm a sports fan, and great coaches and managers, there's kind of two big molds. There's the great tactician, and then there's the great player manager. And I think both of them have proven that they can get success, and it's a winning formula. But when it comes to the workplace and the working world, most managers in that context, I think, fall back on the tactician, following the policies, meeting the targets, that sort of thing. Where if you invested a little more time in being a player manager, or you manage your employees for the individuals, the people they are, you're probably going to reap those dividends, as Mahadeo alluded to. It just requires a bit more investment up front, but you get just as good, if not better, results from it.
Awesome. And let's just briefly touch on this issue of trust. And Paul, I'll come to you. Being trusted to deliver on promised work is the most agreed upon statement among those who feel like they're happy in their jobs. They feel like they are trusted to, and counted on, right? They can be counted on to carry out completed tasks. People can depend on them. It's great that, there are examples of great managers out there, very good managers. Is there something, Paul, that you can say about the difficulty among managers to actually put trust in employees with disabilities? What's that tension there?
Again, I think for me, it goes back to the bias or the preconception of being less capable, and people with disabilities feeling like they constantly have to prove themselves in comparison to a regularly abled person. So in the workplace, that particular statement is so important, because you have to go out of your way to be considered reliable and dependent, and be someone who's capable of doing their job and doing it well. Mm-hmm. So I think that it just speaks to unfamiliarity with managers working with people with disabilities that they assume aren't capable or aren't going to be able to complete their tasks on time or well, or so it's a constant process of trying to over deliver, or just going back to being fulfilled, doing enough to get more respect and more trust, and earn a promotion or more work or more reliability. So it's just maybe broken trust in the workplace when there shouldn't be. You should start from a place of trust as opposed to distrust and having to earn that with your manager.
I really like that you touched on this notion of familiarity. Mahadeo is, on that point, having coworkers that you're familiar with, and then something suddenly happens, and then people's attitudes apparently change. One of the big findings from our study was that coworkers among workers with disabilities, they perceive they've noticed that coworkers are perceived as being more helpful to a worker with a temporary disability than with a permanent disability. Did that surprise you?
No.
Why not?
So you go skiing on the holidays and you break your leg. You're in a cast for 6 weeks, right? So there's I hate to say it this way, there's a pity factor, right? There's that sense of, oh, John's hobbling around on a cane, and on the one hand, this is really sad. On the other hand, perhaps John's not great with hobbling around on crutches, and so it's really funny, right? And so, but there's that sense of solicitation. There's that sense of, oh, can I help you? Oh, you need help. Oh, let me hold the door, or let me pull your chair out for you. Blah blah blah, whatever. But then from the disability perspective, I think if you're thinking about a permanent disability, if you're thinking about somebody like myself who was born blind and I show up in the workplace, there's that, okay, this is a, in the language of insurance companies, this is a pre-existing condition, right? You come into the space, and the helpfulness is some people might say, well, what can I do to be of assistance? And I mean, there might still be that sort of that underlying pity party piece, right? But it's registered differently, right? The sense of a temporary kind of disability, it will go away over time. Your leg will heal, right? With a permanent disability, nobody wants to be seen to be helping anybody for the entirety of their careers. Nobody wants to accept that kind of help for the entirety of their careers. So they're two very kind of different sort of conditions, really. There's social conditions, and so they're going to lead to sort of different perspectives in what kind of help people want to provide and how they want to provide it and how it's going to be accepted, right? In one case, it's socially acceptable to offer and receive. In the other case, it may or may not be socially acceptable to offer and receive, depending on what kind of help it is. And there's much less comfort in that level of collegiality. Thanks,
Mahadeo, and I'll come to Ben just to get his take on your thoughts related to this temporary pity, the social consequences of offering help and so on. But just again, for everyone, coworkers are perceived as being more helpful to a worker with a temporary disability than workers with a permanent disability. What do you think of what Mahadeo said, Ben?
I think it's very similar to what you see with managers as well. There's this idea that this is going to be an extra on top of the work I already have to do to meet these performance metrics. I've got to accommodate this individual. And when we're often assessed and we work in teams so much, I think it's normal that feeling might crop up, but it kind of reveals the fact that we have these broad-based policies for accommodation and accessibility, which is a great starting point, but only a starting point. With the accommodation becomes a more personal, more ongoing kind of attitude and a structure that exists in the workplace. And if you can't see the end of it, the horizon where, oh, you're going to be in a cast for 6 weeks, that consciously or subconsciously, I think it seeps in, and people don't want to offer that sort of help because they think it's another responsibility on top of the work they're already there to do.
John, it's Mahadeo. Yeah. Can I just pick up on one more point? So this question gets at allyship in the workplace and what's it mean to be a disability ally in the context of the workplace. And it's actually really funny because that's the topic of the IDPD roundtable that my team's hosting for CNIB next week. And there was an interesting perspective that I actually heard from a colleague of mine in planning that roundtable. And my colleague said, there is no place for allyship in the workplace, right? I, as a person with a permanent disability, have to demonstrate that I can do my job on my own. I don't need an ally, right? And I mean, everybody works in teams. Nobody does their job on their own anymore. Everybody works in teams. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, however remote your job might be, everybody works in teams.
Yeah.
And teamwork, there's no I in teamwork, right? That's been categorically true ever since the alphabet was created. And so, but for us, for persons with disabilities in the workplace, how do we conceptualize allyship? How do we conceptualize whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, a healthy thing or a poisonous thing? Just food for thought.
Well, thank you. Well, let's chomp down a little further on that as we start to wrap up with just 2 more questions here related to suggested supports. What can we do to improve workplace satisfaction among workers with disabilities? We have more than half of respondents suggested, job training. Job training is extremely important, but then there are other more, I would say maybe less obvious, more interesting just to have a little discussion. And I wanted to read you sort of 3 sort of areas with just 2 quotes to emphasize each area. And Paul, I'm going to come to you for your response first. So one is acceptance and respect. Create an atmosphere of acceptance of all workers. They could not treat us as though we're all different. Don't treat us like we're all different. Better communication and feedback systems. You touched on this too, Paul. Check-ins weekly, per task, monthly. Another person says anonymous suggestion boxes. And finally, patience and flexibility. More flexibility with hours and shifts to accommodate flare-ups. As long as work's getting done, allow us to work at our own pace. Having patience is really important. So, Paul, in light of especially the workplace response to COVID-19, in your opinion, is it realistic for these kinds of improvements to be put into practice now and in the future?
I think it is realistic. Like I said earlier, it's training. You mentioned job training is great in theory. I don't think you can change the culture of an organization with the afternoon seminar. It's more of I'll say a process, a conversation, and it's about everyone being on board, and that kind of culture change isn't an overnight change. But when you have managers that are committed to inclusivity and having that conversation, you can start to make those changes and see progress in the workplace. And I also mentioned this before, it's not necessarily just about disability. It's just being able to interact with individuals and have conversations, and kind of goes both ways. I think to some extent workers with disabilities are going to have to be ready to deal with people using the wrong words or saying the wrong thing, and be willing to educate and not react poorly, to make sure that everyone is getting on the same page and moving in the right direction.
I wrote that down. Afternoon seminar does not equal culture change. Well said, Paul. But Ben, COVID-19 has allowed for more flexibility. It's that's a good thing. But Paul also says, well, it's also important to be in person, right, and see people face to face and connect with them.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's crucial. And I just wanted to add that to Paul's point there around COVID and that sort of thing. How do we realistically put these kind of things into practice? Like we saw with the accommodation you could be afforded with a hybrid or a remote system. Why are these supports only a thing that's for persons with disabilities? You mentioned one of the quotes there about having weekly check-ins, or per task. Who wouldn't love more FaceTime with their manager to check in and make sure the work's going along well? Who doesn't want more compassion and respect in the workplace, right? These aren't necessarily policies focused on disabilities. There's things that could benefit everyone in the workplace here.
Well said. That was well said, right, Mahadeo?
That was absolutely well said, and I think it calls into question the word accommodation. Right? I have a problem with the word accommodation, and anybody who's heard me talk about accessibility and inclusion in the workplace has heard my problem with the word accommodation. And it comes down to, in order to be accommodated, I have to ask you for something. And what happens if I'm having a bad day or you having a bad day, and you just are sort of like, no, I'm not going to give it to you, right? It's not fair. It's not equal. It's not the same as everybody else, right? You know, Mahadeo needs a 40-inch monitor in order to do his job, but everybody else at work has a 24-inch monitor. Why should Mahadeo get a 40-inch monitor, right? Everyone else has a 24-inch monitor. If you ask for a 40-inch monitor, then the next person over is going to ask for a 50-inch monitor, and Ben's going to want to watch the World Cup on a 60-inch monitor, right?
At least.
At least, exactly. And so those are ways that accommodation just goes so off the rails so fast, right?
Yeah.
What if we started talking about environmental design for the workplace? What if we started saying everybody gets a 30-inch monitor? What if we started talking about how instead of size 9 Calibri font, we're all using size 12 Verdana? How about we make sure that all documents, you know, are produced in format and language that everyone will be able to access? How about we do things like inclusive meeting practices? How about we do things like weekly check-ins, and we build them into the fabric of what we do? Because when you build them into the fabric of what you do as leaders, as managers, as a workplace as a whole, then you don't have to be asked for these things because they're always there.
Excellent, man. That would be a really great way to end it, but we're not going to. We're going to have one more thing. Well said, Mahadeo, just in terms of the future. And I'll give Mahadeo the last word again, just so I'll start with Ben and go to Paul and then Mahadeo. In your opinion, given the insights from this study, what topic area or question, you know, deserves future investigation, Ben?
Yeah, I would say, you know, with the theme of this conference is that we need more comparison to the general population. We need to be asking the same kind of questions to everyone, even people who don't necessarily identify as having a disability. If you were to use something like the Washington Group questions to frame disabilities we did in our study, you know, people may find that, oh no, actually I do identify as having trouble remembering or concentrating sometimes. There's other ways to get at this question, and we need to have like for like results. We need to be asking these same questions to workers with disabilities as we're asking all workers, so we could truly understand where are the gaps and where we're falling short.
Thanks a lot, Ben. Paul, and I'll just repeat the question. Given the insights from this study, is there a topic area or question that you think deserves future investigation?
Yeah, I'd be interested to see the other side of the coin. I think we're asking the right questions for the survey, and we're getting answers about, you know, miscommunication with management or bad managers, or mistreatment. So I think to some extent, it's maybe half the conversation where the managers saying, what are your employers, what are their issues, and what are they having trouble with when they're interacting with workers with disabilities? So we just need to, you know, keep the conversation going, include both sides, and you know, in that way, you know, one side can talk about what needs to change all they want, but you need buy-in from everyone. So I think that's the next step.
It's great. I appreciate how this conversation, you know, through the course of it sort of evolved into discussing, you know, both worlds, quote unquote worlds, and how, you know, there's one way to look at it, and there's another way, which is looking at, you know, how benefits changes can be made to benefit everybody in the workplace. Mahadeo, last word to you. What else do you want to learn after, or what? Probably many things, but what's the number one thing you think we should look at next?
I want to learn everything, but there's two things. One thing would be, I think, you know, there's been some chatter about about sector. There's been some chatter about disability group in the Q&A, and as we move into the question and answer period in the networking session, I am actually going to encourage my fellow panelists to get into the Q&A, get into the chat, and see how many of those questions you can answer by typed response versus the ones we want to answer out loud. But I think we can dig in by disability group. We can dig in by sector. We can understand, is the picture that we've identified true broadly, or are there places where it's more true than other places? Are there places where the numbers and the psychometrics might be more close to general population from the original job talk study? Are there places where it's actually worse off than we're seeing here? Are there places where nobody's feeling fulfilled and everybody's a bottom runner, right? And so that's one thing. But then the other thing is, you know what? We have an implementation science tool, and we have a way of figuring out what employee attitudes are, right, in the context of the workplace. So then the question becomes, you know, if persons with disabilities are twice as likely to be bottom rungers and less than 3 times as likely to be fulfilled compared to the original study in the general population, how do we address that? What are the things that we can do to move that needle? And how do we figure that out? And how do we use this tool and these data as a way to say, let's plan for recognizing this is our baseline. The baseline sucks. Now let's go do something about it.
Well said. I'm looking forward to that too. I agree. How can we move people into more happier, more satisfied segments of work? That's going to require a lot of follow-up research. Thanks, everyone.